In 1996, the AIDS epidemic was in full swing. People were dying. People were being turned out of their homes by craven family members, afraid of contracting the disease from simple touch. Federal funding was still criminally inadequate. So people took things into their own hands. One of those things was the Minneapolis to Chicago AIDS ride, a 500-mile charity bicycle ride through Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois to raise money for AIDS research. It was the first of many such rides, and if you want to know more about it, you can ask my husband, John, because he and his brother were among the 1,700 riders on that lengthy track. And perhaps some of you recall Morgan Hughes was also on that ride. With all the stories that emerged from that ride, it's still a toss-up between heartwarming and heartbreaking. Here's one that still makes John and me teary after all these years. Obviously, with 1,700 riders, the interstate wasn't an option, nor were major cities along the way. Instead, the riders were routed through small towns, and that raised some concerns. AIDS hysteria was high, especially in rural America. Would there be problems for riders going through the small conservative towns along the way? There was a small town in Wisconsin on the route, and John's brother Bill was riding at that time with a group of cyclists who stopped there at a local store for bottled water. They knew that all of the locals knew who they were and what they were doing, so the group didn't linger. But as they exited the store, Bill was approached by a man with his young daughter, waiting outside. "Excuse me," he said. He pressed the photograph of another young man into Bill's hand. "This is my brother. He died of AIDS. Please bring him to Chicago." Bill put the photo in the pocket over his heart, and he rode on. On the last day of the ride, the distance was intentionally short so that all the riders could gather at a staging area a few miles from the finish line and ride in together. You have to realize that with 1,700 riders, the men and women were in very different kinds of physical shape. There were riders who finished first every day, and riders who finished last every day, often several hours after the fastest riders had made that day's camp. But this day, the last day, they gathered as one to enter Chicago's Grant Park as one body, united in one goal: to end the scourge of AIDS. The goal was maximum impact, and they reached it. Those of us at the finish line cheered and cheered and cheered as the riders came in. They had on multicolored t-shirts, all the colors of the rainbow, which you know is a symbol that still signifies human rights for the LGBT community. That day we celebrated. We celebrated with all our might. But the riders didn't stop the AIDS epidemic. It continued, as it continues to this day. So I wouldn't blame you for asking, what was the point? Wasn't the celebration a little premature? Good question. Because something similar was going on in Jerusalem 2,000 years ago. Jesus had reached the finish line, Jerusalem, and the people celebrated. But it didn't end Roman oppression. In fact, it ended in Jesus' death. So what was the point of it all? Here's the story. Jesus has finally arrived in Jerusalem. There's excitement and energy. It's the time of the festival. At one end of town, Pontius Pilate and the imperial soldiers are marching in, riding on horseback, because Rome always has a heavy presence in troublesome Jerusalem during the major holidays. And then at the other end of town, Jesus and his band of followers arrive, and their procession is a conscious parody of the imperial one. Both are making a statement, one for the empire of Caesar and the other for the kingdom of God. This description comes to us from Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan, two biblical scholars who wrote about it in their book, The Last Week. It's great stuff. The two processions make it clear that there is an imperial way of power, domination, and war. And there is the Jesus way of transformation, equality, and peace. Two processions, two alternatives, two different ways of being in the world. We all know that Rome won that round. But here's where I want to focus this morning. So what? So what if Rome won that round? Does that mean Palm Sunday was a fool's errand? It went nowhere. It started the week off with a bang, but things went south so fast, the disciples must have wondered if they dreamed it. When you think about how the week ended, it's tempting to dismiss Palm Sunday as a fluke. Does a celebration like that really ring true, considering how quickly it ended in death? I think it rings truer than we might think. Palm Sunday is integral to the events that we call Holy Week. And why is that? Because it presents a vision of the way things can be that erupts right in the middle of the way things are. And for one day, in one place, for one group of people, it's all true. The kingdom of God, that alternative vision of transformation, equality, peace, it exists. It's a reality. With empire all around them, Jesus and his followers have an experience of God's kingdom. It doesn't last long, but it lasts long enough for celebration, and it lasts long enough to establish that ideal for all generations to come. And this is what that ideal looks like. It looks like Jesus deliberately riding on a donkey, surrounded by people who aren't supposed to mix with each other, but who do so with evident delight. That donkey has never before been ridden, which is Bible speak for pay attention. This isn't status quo. This is a new thing. And along the street, people recognize that this is not the old way of doing things. This is something different. And joy surges through their hearts. They shout, Hosanna. They strew the path with palm branches, which signify victory. But in this case, the victory is not a military one, but one of peace. This king is the King of peace. And this peace, peace between nations, peace between neighbors, peace within families, peace within our own hearts and minds, this is the kind that only results from justice and equality. Palm Sunday gives us a brief demonstration of the way things could be, of the way things should be. And it tells us that when times like this do come, for however long they last, we should celebrate them. It doesn't matter what came before or what will come after. When life is good, when things come together just right, when we're filled with gratitude and delight, we shout, Hosanna, and we celebrate. The Palm Sunday celebration didn't last for Jesus and his disciples, and Palm Sunday celebrations don't last for us either. But if we can make them a part of who we are the richer for it. Consider this. We tell our stories not by telling every single detail, but by giving some things weight and different things value. We choose the highlights. We pick what to lift up, what we think is important for people to know about us. Everyone experiences those close to heaven ideal times when we wave palm branches and shout Hosanna. And everyone has also had experiences that feel like hell on earth. Painful times when we know violence or unbearable loss. When the palm branches turn into a cross that is too heavy to bear. Some of us tell our stories by highlighting the hard times. Others of us tell our stories about who we are by highlighting the good times. If we think of life as a river that we cross, birth on one shore, death on the other, and the events of our lives are stepping stones, we remember them as stepping stones, then what is your path of stones? What events stand out for you? What do you lift up? Do a midstream pause and look back. Consciously or unconsciously, we use our memories as markers. And some of us focus on the negative experiences, creating our identity by going from one hurt or disappointment or loss to another. Then these become our stepping stones, the markers, the chapters of our life story. But that's kind of like going from Good Friday to Good Friday. Some of us choose instead to focus on the positive experiences, creating our identity by going from one memory of gratitude or blessing or enjoyment to another. These become our stepping stones, the markers, the chapters of our life story. This is more like going from Palm Sunday to Palm Sunday, celebrating whenever we get as close to the ideal as possible. My husband John could tell you stories of broken ribs, a flat tire, camps with overflowing toilets, but that's not how he remembers the ride. He remembers the feeling of being part of a huge community of people, all united in one goal. He remembers riding into Grant Park with people lined up on both sides, cheering and cheering. He remembers Bill's story of the man who wanted him to bring my brother to Chicago, which Bill did. He brought that photograph, and it wasn't the only photograph lovingly carried there. Many other riders had pictures of loved ones or memories etched in their hearts, and all of them, a great cloud of witnesses were there that day in Grant Park, and all of us were celebrating. Jesus didn't overthrow the empire, but he put an alternative idea out there. An idea that people still find meaningful, that they still find worthy of spending their whole lives trying to embody. We find our strength in the times we get, when we get it right like this, when we celebrate them, with all our hearts. The riders from Minneapolis to Chicago didn't stop AIDS in its tracks, but they put an idea out there that someday it would be possible to survive AIDS. And right now, people could come together and out of their differences work for the common good. They could raise money, raise awareness, raise hope. Both riders and bystanders experienced that kind of power that day, and we celebrated it with all our hearts. We had no clue then that within a year, a new antiretroviral drug therapy would become standard treatment, eventually turning AIDS from a death sentence to a survivable disease. If, and this is an if for another sermon, the medication is affordable and available. All we knew that day was that people were dying, and hope was all we had. And so we celebrated. We celebrated the hope that stirred in us as wave after wave of colorful cyclists went by. One more thing about celebrations, especially when the event is the restoration of justice, or the vindication of the oppressed, or the equitable distribution of material goods and medical care. When we reach the street where the celebration is taking place, when we throw down our palm branches and proclaim the victory of peace and well-being, when we shout, Hosanna, we don't know who all we are carrying with us. Bill never knew the name of the man whose picture he brought to Chicago. He only knew him as a brother who had been loved and was now mourned. But we do know that this is true. We are all carrying others who haven't made it as far as we have. And when this celebration is over, and our time is past, then others will carry us to a finish line that we can't see. And the struggle for justice and peace, for equality and health, for the kingdom of God will carry on. Hosanna.